welcome to the Sage's Climate Science Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Young, environmental scientist and science communicator. And today we are going into cities, places, urban life to talk about how that interacts with climate. And I'm thrilled that I've got two wonderful guests with me to help us have this conversation. The first is Sarah Crowe. You are a hydronation scholar and interdisciplinary PhD student at the University of Dundee. Your research investigates how blue-green infrastructure, spatial planning, placemaking, and community participation can help combine to increase climate resilience to bring benefits both to people and to the environment. You also have a Master of Arts degree in urban regeneration and a Master of Science in spatial planning. And your previous work experience has actually spanned the different fields of regeneration, economic development, urban planning, community development, and working with lots of different stakeholders like local authorities, housing associations, and our environment agency, SEPA, here in Scotland. And importantly, you're also a chartered town planner and chartered manager with the Chartered Management Institute. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And I also have Fatemeh Mahmoudnejad, who is a third-year PhD researcher in urban planning at the University of Dundee. You also have an MSc in urban planning and a BSc in geospatial surveying. You've worked both in academia but also in practice for over a decade, and in your home country, Iran, this is where you were before you started the PhD in urban planning in 2021. You are also a chartered urban planner, and actually you were the first woman qualified as a chartered surveyor in your hometown in the north of Iran in 2014. Fantastic. And the research you do now focuses on inclusive participation in planning, particularly co-designing plans with visions of local communities in Scotland, and especially how they can engage in shaping their place, drawing from participatory projects. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Today we are going to talk about where people live, places, particularly that kind of urban city landscape. I guess, Sarah, to kick us off, what climate or kind of wider environmental impacts are we seeing, particularly in these urban environments?
Well, we've seen a lot more instances of flooding in our urban environments, and I think that's really predominantly down to all the hard surfaces that we're having, which reduces the ability of the ground to absorb the water. We're seeing some high levels of air pollution. I think urban areas are really high contributor to CO2 emissions as well. And I think the climate ultimately has an impact on our mental health as well, that people are getting increasingly more anxious about the climate that they're living in, and anxious to do more about it and about the problems it's bringing.
I think that's it, isn't it? We've changed the surface of where we live because there's that song that's got concrete jungle where dreams are made of, talking about New York, but I guess that's a lot of places where we've seen different infrastructure. And so Fatemeh, particularly as you're new to Scotland, what have you seen in that landscape of urban areas and environmental issues?
So I think because of my research, I have been working with local communities. Climate change has been affecting local communities who lives in deprived areas. So they experience these extreme weather events in another level. And then there are vulnerable people like senior citizens, children, or young moms. They experience these extreme events in a very different way and in a very severe way. So I think when we think about climate change, we need to have these communities into mind, and then what they need in terms of climate change effects.
And thinking about these environments, so we've got urban areas, and we know that we've got hard surfaces, Sarah, as you were talking about, where water just can't seep in, so it sits and often causes flooding. We do have a lot more cars and different emissions coming there. We've also got a lot of heat. I guess that's a picture in time, but Sarah, how has that changed over time? I guess there's been a growth in urbanisation. How has that contributed to some of these environmental impacts that we're seeing?
We're seeing a lot more, hard engineered services, a lot more impermeable surfaces. And going back to what I said earlier, it's reducing the ground's ability to filter the water slowly. It's increasing flood risk as well.
And in terms, Fatemeh, of some of those other impacts, are we seeing things like extreme heat in urban centres? And how has that happened over time?
planners and designers, we used to make our cities more environmentally conscious. But nowadays, because of the rapid urbanization that happened and the population growth, we moved away from those type of planning and designing cities and those type of architecture and infrastructure building. Historically, planners and designers, they built cities more environmentally conscious. For example, in my home country, Iran, we have this system of qanats or qanats in Persian that are underground water management systems that they are used in desert areas to manage water in a way that the heat doesn't affect the function. We had to grow fast. We had to expand our cities very fast. And then we ended up having lots of buildings and infrastructure, roads made out of cement or asphalt, that they all are heat absorbing. And then it made our cities warmer. And they are now, the impact that is there is urban heat island impact. So the urban areas, for example, Glasgow, I think there is a report that says that the urban area in Glasgow is 4 to 6 degrees hotter than the surrounding and rural areas. So that's the effect that I think cities and the way they are built has on the climate change.
Sarah, thinking about that urban heat island, when I walk into a Scottish city centre, I don't really feel the heat. But what does that look like in reality, even around the world?
I agree with you, Laura. Exactly. We're not necessarily used to heat here in Scotland. But on a recent holiday, I was in Antwerp in Belgium, and it was 33 degrees in the shade, and it was so hot. We were just going from shade to shade and from place to place, just looking for somewhere to be away from the sun. It was so hot. We literally just we didn't feel like we could enjoy the city, the experience of the city, without dodging from the sun. And we found some plazas. They were covered spaces, lots of trees blocking the sun. Folk were there playing ball games, and actually it was a much more pleasant place to be than an area in full sun. So I think it's important to realise, actually, just because we're not experiencing these problems here in Scotland doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen across the world. Exactly. And as well, there's many places that suffer these effects one after the other. So we might experience severe flooding accompanied by a heat wave. So there's lots of challenges for these places.
Yeah, you get areas that have the hottest summer and then the wettest winter, and that is two really extremes, and it's hard, and actually adapting to both of those is different, but we can do it together. And as we move towards adapting to climate change alongside mitigation, so mitigation being, trying to reduce our fossil fuel use and try to be more sustainable in our activity, we do also need to adapt, and this is what our whole conversation is about. It's how do we make places better. When I think of how we do that, my head is telling me low emission zones, it's 20-minute neighbourhoods, it's different ways of, planning and the way that things look. But some of those, Sarah, are buzzwords and can be quite contentious, can be a bit controversial. How do we navigate that landscape, particularly when, we've got social media, everybody's got opinions on it, but also the communication's maybe not great. How do we tackle that?
You're right, Laura. The blue-green infrastructure in 20 minutes can be very controversial, contentious subjects. From my own experience, I've seen blue-green installations at a neighbourhood level, but they've required the removal of car parking spaces, and that causes an awful lot of animosity. So I think it's really understanding about what communities want and how communities are going to use this space. There's some example of some rain gardens that were installed outside a shop, and folk are using it as a car park rather than its intended purpose. And right now it looks a complete mess, and people are saying, why on earth have we got this rather than the car parking space that we needed? So it's about understanding that these concepts, it isn't, again, a one-size-fits-all approach, and we have to understand from communities what it is that they want and some of their concerns around blue-green infrastructure. As well, going back to pedestrianisation of places. It was concerns that were brought up in the interviews I carried out of that pedestrianisation would reduce footfall into local businesses, and that led to some resistance. However, in reality, this hasn't happened, and in fact, they've seen visitor numbers go up because it's a more pleasant place to be and people want to spend time there.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? It's about showing the benefits that can happen, but also doing a bit of explanation. You know, I've seen nice little plaques in my park that say, you know, this area has been left to go wild. You know, you will see beautiful wildflowers at some points, and at other points it might look messy, but actually this is what it's been used for. And I think that's the same with a lot of these blue-green infrastructure. You know, you might have an area that is a pond in a flood, but it's dry at other times, and a wee sign can actually go a long way to help telling people what that is. So I think that's helpful.
I think some local interpretation is great, and I also think having especially young children involved in the design of these things. So this isn't necessarily it's not a blue-green infrastructure, but Broughty for Every Flood scheme has had young children come in, and they have some of their designs are integrated within that flood reduction scheme, and it's really nice to see, and it gives that sense of ownership from local people, and they can go, such and such, the local school was involved in designing this, and there's a wee plaque to go with it to say exactly who did that design.
That's lovely.
Yes.
And I think that's such an important point, because we don't often think about heat in Scotland.
Yes, exactly.
Probably because we want more of it. And actually, I remember in the last few years, particularly in the news, when they were talking about heat, they would bring out these amazing heat maps where you would actually be able to put in your postcode and look at where you lived, and it would show a really colourful diagram actually showing the heat above your city. And I'm from Glasgow, and I remember looking at it and thinking, wow, the city centre is absolutely roasting compared to when you get out to the leafy suburbs, but also the places where parks were. So you've got Pollok Country Park and Queen's Park, and I'm now living in Dundee, and I know that's where you're both as well. And so you kind of look at Dundee and you see that there's, you know, down at the riverside, or you've got these other parks, and actually you can see the impact. And that is because these concrete jungles that we've created are trapping so much heat, as you said, and having that urban heat island effect, which is a bit of a bizarre concept, because you think of an island with water, but actually it's this island in the middle that's really hot. And Sarah, I guess thinking of where our cities and urban areas are, there are some that are in, I would say, quite vulnerable areas. You know, Dundee, which is where we are all based doing our research, you know, it's on a river and then moving into the coast. You know, are some of our urban places, are they in the wrong places, and how have we had to mitigate some of the impacts they might see, like flooding?
I wouldn't say necessarily they're in the wrong places. They're there because historically it was important for them to be there, whether it was for shipping or fishing or that type of thing. And I think that has left certain communities very vulnerable. And what we're seeing across Scotland and certainly across the UK as well is flood walls used to reduce flood risk. And for example, building these ever higher flood walls really disconnects people from a place. You know, it's losing those views out towards the sea. It's restricting people's access to a beach. And what we're seeing now is people and communities being resistant to flood walls being put up in their communities as well.
And I think that's an interesting point, because on one hand, it feels quite secure to have a huge defence, even though we'll maybe get into, you know, how well that works alongside other things. But absolutely that sense of place, you know, people lived in these places for some of the beautiful environments, and of course building huge structures can maybe take that away. And I guess, Sarah, continuing with you, you know, how are we tackling some of these issues? And we've talked about having quite a hard engineering past in the ways that we've tried to handle, whether it's heat or flooding or air pollution. Are we still on that hard engineering journey, or are there new ways through planning and infrastructure that we're trying to help alleviate some of these problems?
It's a good question. Thanks, Laura. I think we're seeing a bit of both, to be quite honest with you. We're seeing moves towards blue-green infrastructure, which is a natural and semi-natural areas of interconnected spaces, and that brings benefits not just for flood risk, but for wider climate adaptation, and it also brings wider livability and sustainability benefits. But this is still quite new. The economic benefits are hard to quantify, which means that we are seeing some of the business as usual approaches being taken, and quite a remaining preference for the hard engineered solutions that we're trying to get away from. And that's not to say that we don't need grey infrastructure solutions to flood risk. We do still need those, but we could also look at using more blue-green solutions as well, as maybe in some instances a small percentage of reducing flood risk, but that the small percentage in terms of reducing flood risk can have a big impact on making people's quality of life much better.
And for anyone who's listening who doesn't know what blue-green infrastructure is, I guess you talked about that was a mixture of nature, maybe a little bit of engineering, but the blue, I'm assuming, is water, and the green is kind of nature, so plants and trees. So what does blue-green infrastructure look like? Have you got an example for people to sort of imagine what it might be?
So where I live, we have a sustainable urban drainage system, and normally that system is dry. But when it rains, that has the capacity to hold water as well. So it stops it flooding the surrounding properties. But it's also a nice place to be. There's trees, there's plants surrounding that as well. But when it's full of water, it is quite a nice place to look at. I think the downside to this type of thing, it often gets full of rubbish, because no one really is responsible for cleaning it, or if someone is responsible, they don't do the job. And there's a perceived health and safety risk around it. You know, we hear people saying, "Oh, what if the children fall in?" and that type of thing. So, yeah, it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
So a bit of education. And I think I've certainly noticed them around those newer build estates, because actually it's something that we've realised is if we take fields and grass and lovely spaces like that and put houses on top, we're changing what's on top, and so we need to put in these SUDs, the sustainable urban drainage. So I guess that hopefully answers people's questions as well if they've ever seen one of these and don't know. Have you got any other examples, Fatemeh, of blue-green infrastructure or things that people might see in their environment that would help them understand what we're talking about?
I think we need to go back to the history of cities. People used to live locally, so people used to be surrounded with nature. There was trees, there was all sorts of biodiversity around them, and if they had any blue infrastructure like rivers, like seas or ocean around their cities, so they would make the most out of that. You could see that these infrastructure would benefit their lives in many ways. It could boost the economy or public health, or even air circulation within the city. So what we have done was that we moved away from that type of that lifestyle, and now we are trying to going back to that lifestyle again.
I think it's becoming a lot more normal to see blue-green infrastructure in our environments, and people may not necessarily realise what that is. Mm-hmm. So if you're walking along the road and you see a very small triangular area, perhaps that is a rain garden. So you might see some plants going there, but again, that's to store the rain in times of heavy rainfall.
And I think that's the key thing. It's little changes mm-hmm. rather than huge infrastructure. I think I've spotted even small things like bus shelters that have got a green roof. Great for biodiversity, stores a bit of extra water, helps with air pollution in the same way that there's these little pockets of plants or other measures to, one, help, I guess, with flooding, but also make places look a bit nicer and clean up some of the air. And Sarah, you mentioned a few with the one that you've got. You said, actually, there's this bit in my housing estate that helps with flooding and capturing water. It's also quite nice to look at. What are the kind of wider benefits that we see when we choose blue-green infrastructure over a sort of hard engineering solution to various different problems?
It helps us retain and enhance that sense of place. So we're not putting up a big wall, we're not obstructing our views, we're not obstructing access to our green space and our blue space. It has some physical health benefits as well. So, you know, a green corridor, for example, might encourage you to walk along that space or cycle along that space. It also contributes to better air quality. I think all around as well, just better mental health for people to be more connected with nature and that natural environment.
And air pollution, I think, is something from a Scottish context we are beginning to think about. We've had low emission zones put in place to help tackle air pollution, but I guess that's trying to tackle it before it gets to a really bad stage. And it was interesting. I was at the COP conference in Egypt, and they've got many different things going on there and lots of negotiations and lots of side events. But there was a sort of art mixed with a real world experience thing that you could take part in. And it was an air pollution exhibition. And it was these amazing domes that there was 3 of them. And so they had these almost like greenhouse domes, and you could see through them, and inside it just looked a bit foggy. And what it was you walked through these domes, and in each dome they had simulated air pollution from a different city around the world. So I think one was London, one was Delhi, and one was Hong Kong or something like that. And you wandered through, and the final one was nothing. It was sort of clean air, and that was the point. And I think that was such a real, well, it was a whole body experience walking through and realising actually a lot of these cities and countries are so far on with air pollution that actually it made me come back and go, I'm really glad we're tackling air pollution now before it gets to this stage. But I think seeing it in that way helped. But I guess it's sometimes difficult to explain to people these problems because you can't see them, or it's not an issue. And I guess for you, Fatemeh, when we think about changing places, whether that's putting in blue-green infrastructure or just changing them from the history that we've had, what are some of the barriers when it comes to change, particularly when we're trying to change to make places better for people and environmentally?
I think the barriers that usually the UK face is that some people resist to change, or resistance to change. So the way that I think we should go about change is that it should come from the community itself, and they should be involved within the process so that they can contribute to the issues that is going on, and they could be part of the solution themselves. So I think that's the best way, because they are the one who are experiencing everything in their everyday life, and they should be part of planning for the future as well.
Have you got, one example of this?
I think there is an ongoing conversation about we need more neighborhoods. We need to build communities. We need to build livable neighborhoods. We need to make sure that people who are going to live in those areas, they are provided with the high quality of living standard. So they need green spaces, they need blue spaces, for example. They need infrastructure that are resilient to climate change and also future crises. And also we need to make sure that we don't contribute to the problems that we have already now. So, for example, we don't end up having housing that contribute to more air pollution by making people more dependent on their cars, for example, for commute, and many other things that we need to consider when we are building more neighborhoods rather than housing.
And I think that's the key thing, particularly when new governments come in or different regulations come in, and we do see a boom in houses being needed to meet a need, absolutely. But we don't want houses and nothing else. Houses, but you have to drive everywhere. There's no shop, there's no school, there's no doctor surgery, and no nice space to sit and enjoy your neighbourhood. And Sarah, your research in Dundee is looking at flooding, it's looking at environmental issues, both at a physical level. So actually, if you were to put a pin in a map, you could quantify some of the risk or vulnerability. But you're also doing a sort of interdisciplinary project where you're bringing in people in social science above that. Could you tell us a bit about how you see that relationship between communities and placemaking and contributing to change?
I think communities are absolutely fundamental to placemaking. And I'd just like to pick up on a comment Fatemeh made actually about communities really need to be engaged in this process, because if we don't, there's a real risk of creating places that don't meet what people want. And then it won't be used, or then there's a potential for communities to think, do you know what, this blue-green infrastructure, it's a load of rubbish, we don't want it here. And that is really quite damaging. So we need to really engage communities in that process and understand the real risk that communities are facing within their communities and what the challenges are that they're wanting to address. As well, there's so much talk at the moment and so much on the news about climate change and these awful, disastrous scenes that we're seeing across the world. Within our local communities, they're facing a lot of problems at the moment with cost of living and different types of pressures. And I think what we're seeing on the other side of the world doesn't necessarily filter down to what real communities are experiencing on the ground. So I think getting that message across that climate change does impact them, but in a more local and in a more relevant way to them, in order to get that message across and to really help them find something within this wider climate emergency that resonates with them to help them make a change.
I think that's a really important point. And there's also so much knowledge, locked up in these communities. And I've got some friends who live in Dundee and were impacted by a lot of flooding last year. And they said it was interesting because actually when they got to have conversations with people from all the relevant authorities who were helping, yes, they had great maps that were, there to say, here's where the flooding is, you're at risk, or we expect through our models this is going to happen. Actually, the community were able to say, well, see that road at the bottom, that's the one that normally gets blocked up first, or that's where the flooding starts. And they were also able to say, and see that couple down the road, actually she's not doing that well, and they're quite elderly, so maybe if you're wanting to help people, and can you make sure you get to them? And actually through that community there was just so much knowledge, but it isn't always there on a map. You're not able to just read that. You have to speak to them. And Fatemeh, I know that your work has looked at, how do we be inclusive when it comes to community engagement and get as many people involved? Is everybody included in decision making? Are there certain groups that are more involved and some that are maybe underrepresented?
In my research, I think I came across many interesting findings and observations about who is usually engaged and who is not. So in Scotland, it is more likely for you to see, for example, middle-aged male and more affluent people from the Scottish background. They are participating. They are very comfortable voicing their interest, their opinion in the roundtable discussions. And then there are lots of underrepresentation from other segments of society, like the ethnic groups, for example, young adults, the working adults with young children, for example, or people from low economic background, or people with mental health issues or physical disabilities. These are the people who are usually underrepresented. And these the interesting thing is that these are the people who are mostly affected by the effect of climate change or any type of crisis that might be happening. When it comes to topics like climate change, as Sarah mentioned, it is not tangible to many of our local communities. The impact is not tangible, and they see that far from happening. And then the other issue is that for people who, I came across this in my research a lot, actually, in my interviews with local communities and also practitioners and local authority members, that people who are living in the survival mode, I think topics like climate change comes from a place of privilege for them. So they don't think about that in a way that we are thinking about that as practitioners or as professionals. So I think the way that we can go about it is that to make it as tangible as possible for them, to make it relevant, to show how relevant it is in their everyday lives. So, yeah.
I think just finding that's something that resonates with communities.
Yes, exactly.
And I think it is about communicating that, isn't it? It's finding either how climate is going to impact them or showing them that maybe some of the impacts they actually are seeing are linked. I think there's been great work done as well. I was chatting to some sports organisations who were actually talking about how climate is beginning to impact their sports, and how when it gets too wet and flooding occurs, like big football pitches are the first places to just be out of bounds, because guess what? It's now a pond. You know, there's no way of being able to play football on there. Or there was actually some sports teams down in London in the summer who were saying, actually, it's too hot for us to play. Like, actually, it's dangerous. We can't encourage people to come out in this heat and be playing sports. And for those groups, it actually took it, I guess, linking to how it impacts sports for them to maybe see the impact and how climate change is something that they should be considering. In the same way that I think it's important to kind of help with intersectionality. That's the kind of big word that has come on the scene in recent years. But, you know, even conversations like when we talk about adapting, you know, a lot of impacts of climate, you know, sometimes we talk about flooding, but there's also the opposite of flooding. And by opposite, I actually mean the opposite direction. So you've got roofs and you've got water coming through roofs and you've got leaking roofs and that sort of thing. And so, you know, it's also talking to people about sea getting double glazing, or, you know, dealing with damp and mold. Like, that's, you know, not just something for climate, it's also just to help people live in homes that, you know, give them dignity, and homes that support them. And so it's kind of bringing these issues together of whether it's sport or arts or education, health, but also with, you know, just cost of living and all of these things linked together. And I think that can be helpful. But I guess that does sometimes take a conversation. And Sarah, thinking of, you know, we have these groups that are underrepresented and we've got this aim to be more inclusive. How do we get there? How do we make community engagement more inclusive so that we have more voices around the table, so that we make better places for more people?
Well, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach to this kind of thing.
That would be easy.
Yeah. We need to tailor our communication method to our audiences. So understanding how to reach out to those harder to reach groups that Fatemeh has been talking about, whether that be going beyond the normal means of community engagement, so in your local church hall or that type of thing, you know, going to meet people where they might ordinarily meet. So, for example, mums and toddlers groups, places like playgrounds, for example, where you might get parents with the kids and you can go and engage with them there. I was involved in a project a few years ago, and we had a stall at a community fete in a local village, and we had hook a duck for the kids, and while the kids were busy, we got the parents to fill out some forms and to give us their feedback. So really just tailoring that communication method and making it fun as well, and understanding that everybody's busy. Not everybody has the time to go and attend a community consultation that might take an hour or two or even more out of the day. And some people might want to do some armchair engagement, whether that's online survey or something like that. So just give people a range of options.
And I guess, you know, now, what are some of the ways that traditionally we do capture people's views? I guess I'm thinking there's sometimes online consultations and things. How have we traditionally done that?
There's more formal consultations, like your local authority will consult on its local development plan and you can provide your input into that. Things like participatory budgeting for local authorities, where you can go and give your view on how the council should spend some money in the community, so such as Dundee's Climate Fund. But there's also less formal ways to get involved as well, so such as like the workshops I'm running as part of my PhD, where you can come along, we play with Lego and other craft items to generate ideas to resolve flood risk, but that also bring lots of other benefits for people. And that's run in a really fun way. We have snacks, we have tea and coffee, and it's just to encourage that informal conversation.
I know, I think that can sometimes be the way, right? It's how do you entice people in, especially knowing people are busy, but then gathering all that information from them.
I think it's always hard as well when engagement seems to come from the top down at a local authority or more government level. People are perhaps suspicious about the reason for engagement as well, or there's a bit of I don't really want to provide my feedback in this context. There's a view that certainly from the workshops I've done, from the interviews that I've done, people think, well, my views aren't acted upon anyway. So I think it's not just about engaging with communities, but making sure their views are reflected and that they can see the impact of what they've said.
And Fatemeh, the work that you've done is all about kind of getting those voices. What are some of the ways that you see we could do that better?
One of the projects that I was working that I was researching, one participant told me that they didn't understand a few words that was very fundamental in the agenda that was set during the session. So, and one of those words was community identity. And that was so ambiguous and vague for the community because they couldn't understand what the practitioners meant by community identity, because it can be many things and they couldn't grasp. And so it comes so natural to us as professionals that identity, it's not a big word, it's not a complicated or complex word, but when we think about planning to engage with local communities, it's very important to think how they might think.
I like the fact that you're talking about complex terminology. When I did my community and stakeholder workshops, that was a really strong theme. As I use placemaking a lot in my research, and I use blue-green infrastructure. But some communities have no idea what that is. They're like, well, what is placemaking? So these terms don't necessarily translate to what people see on the ground. They might know them when you explain in a different way what they are. But just because we understand what they are as professionals doesn't mean that everybody else does. So again, it's really important just to tailor our communication method and make sure that what the message that we're trying to give to the communities is something that they can understand, and that enables them to provide their very important feedback as well from their side of things. Because if they don't know what we're trying, what we're saying, then how on earth are they supposed to give us relevant feedback? So it's really important just to understand where people are coming from at that ground level.
And also, I think something that is very important is that not just giving them a platform, but giving them a safe space to speak their mind. And that, I think, can only be provided for the community with them, and in a way that they really feel that they are part of the discussion, as they should. So that's the main important thing. They are usually silent when they think that they don't matter, or their voice doesn't matter, or they're not being heard. So they need to feel confident that taking the time, making the effort, being there and voicing their needs actually is going to have a real impact, a tangible impact in their neighborhoods and their communities.
I remember someone once told me a fact that if you were to look at any kind of major city in the UK, you can normally draw a boundary west and east, and you would have more affluence on the west than you would on the east. And someone said this to me, and I thought, that's odd. I wonder why that is. And they said, well, actually, it's to do with planning and nature and air pollution, because during the Industrial Revolution, when all these major cities were, pumping out fumes from coal-powered facilities, all of that would create really dirty, unclean air, lots of air pollution. And the winds in the UK blow from west to east. And so all this dirty pollution that was being created in the city centres was moving eastward, creating a really horrible kind of environment to live and work in. But actually that's how you ended up having this financial affluence divide that is then further been entrenched as time has gone on. And as you say, Fatemeh, it's also a lot of these communities that because of these multiple layers of problems, have been kind of further pushed down the list and are most vulnerable to to not just air pollution nowadays, which obviously is not from coal industry anymore, but it's from cars and lots of other factors. But actually, often they do tend to be the places with, you know, the least resilience when it comes to things like flooding or the poorest quality of environmental spaces. And so I think, yeah, it's really important to be considering who is around the table. Not because the people there aren't great. Actually, it's lovely that so many people get involved in community councils and consultations, and we really appreciate people giving their time. But it is that recognition that there are voices missing, and they are the ones most impacted and with the least amount of resilience because of many factors over time. And I guess that kind of leads us on to, well, I think there's a huge part for us to do as researchers to continue to research this, to find out not only what are the great solutions environmentally, you know, we need to bring down air pollution, we need to try and alleviate flooding, we need to put in more blue-green infrastructure, create more biodiversity, create better places. And that's for researchers and planners to do. I guess there's also sort of local authority government bit as well about funding, about how this all from the top down, and we've got different planning frameworks and things that come out of the government. And business is probably in there too. But I guess for people who are maybe listening to this thinking, do you know, I have never once answered a consultation or I've never once gone to a community event. For people who are thinking, I love my community, I've been in it for ages, or maybe they've just moved somewhere, they're new. How can people be aware of what's going on, have their voice heard, get involved, acknowledging that there are all these barriers and we need to address them? But like, what can people do to find out about getting their voice heard or finding out about some of these activities that are happening?
There are calls from local authorities for developing plans, and also nowadays local place plans. So they can be online or in person, and they are advertised on the websites, city council's websites, and also social media. So there are lots of ways. Sarah.
I think things as well is to get involved with local citizen science projects such as Urban Relief in Dundee.
And I think that's a great example, actually, because citizen science is a great way for people to actually contribute to the work that we're all doing, which is science, and it can sometimes feel out of reach, but actually be able to share that community knowledge that we were talking about. You know, they're the ones who know their place best. And sometimes, you know, researchers or consultants are coming in blind. You know, they don't know these areas. Hopefully we can get to know them. But I think that's important. And the Dundee Urban Relief is a great example where it's not only encouraging people to get out and see some of their city, but actually learn about some of the stuff that's happening, these nature-based solutions we were talking about, and also then contribute, give their feedback and give their comments. And I think that's really powerful.
There's one, a citizen science project not too far away from where I live in Stonehaven, and they ask folk to take pictures when they walk along the beach just so they can track how much the beach has changed over a period of time, which is a great idea. You just go along, take a snap, upload it, and that's it done.
I think that's amazing.
Yes.
Well, this has been so interesting to hear from you both, because in Scotland, in the UK, in many parts of the world, the most people that we have live in urban areas. And in urban areas, we have these kind of overlapping climate impacts, whether that is the urban heat islands where things are so hot because of all the concrete. We also have air pollution, and we are trying to tackle that with sometimes controversial things like low emission zones, but important to navigate this. And of course, we have big impacts like flooding. Places like we are recording today in Glasgow has a river running right through the centre, and lots of other places are coastal or next to rivers. But I think the key thing is that we keep in mind the history of planning, like you were saying, Fatemeh, and understand that we've built places maybe without the future in mind, and now we need to go back actually to how we began and working with nature. And Sarah, the blue-green infrastructure that is becoming a lot more common, I think is wonderful, because it doesn't just address things like flooding and air pollution, air quality. Actually, it's looking at how do we just create better places, right? And, you know, we're all researching in Dundee, and Dundee has an amazing local paper that's doing data journalism about the high street, right? And that's a whole other aspect of this. But actually, it was interesting that in a survey they did about why people were or weren't using the high street, they were saying it's because of the way it looked. You know, it wasn't a very nice place, and actually making nice places gives people that sense of place that we talk about, and also can help boost the local economy. But definitely what you've talked about is understanding that when we do consultations, right, like not everybody's around the table, not everybody's involved. And so there's steps for different stakeholders to be making that more inclusive. And it was great as well for those tips at the end for people to think, well, actually, how can I find out about what's going on? So local community groups, your councils, social media and website pages, and then actually thinking about, what are some of the more exciting citizen science projects that are kind of ongoing. So Sarah and Fatemeh, thank you so much for joining us on the Sages podcast, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for having us.